34 minutes past the hour. It is indeed the Jeff Santos Show they are tuned into. We'll keep you abreast of what's happening in New Hampshire's race tonight. And obviously we'll continue to talk about it on tomorrow's show, 6 to 8 right here. As I said, we'll talk to our good friend Joe Williams of the U.S. News and World Report magazine, formerly Revolution Radio Network as well. But it's now time to go to the West Coast, folks. Time to go to Seattle, WA, and continue the discussion of progressive politics that we always have. It's great to talk to the activist, the musician, the journalist, Mark Taylor-Canfield from the great city of Seattle that brought us some great music of Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Jimi Hendrix and Heart, too. Played a little Nirvana last time. All good in my book. And I think in Mark's, too. It is a Jeff Santos Show. And let's bring in our good friend, Mr. Mark Taylor-Canfield. How are you, Mark?
I'm good, Jeff. I also would tell people there's an excellent band out of Seattle called The Galaxy Machine, which is the band that I've been involved with for years. And we have a music video up at YouTube called Harmony Wine. So you can check that out, The Galaxy Machine. And I'm doing okay, Jeff. I've been editing video for my YouTube channel, the MTC Report, and helping produce the Democracy Cast, our podcast for Democracy Watch News. And I have some new music, so I'm gonna send some music to the producer so you guys can play some of the tracks during our segment. But last night I was out really late, as you know. I got invited to a VIP party at Seattle's best music station, KEXP, where we heard an amazing Latino band called Cafe Tacuba, which blew everybody's minds. And so even on a Monday night, Jeff, Seattle's still rocking.
Awesome. Well, it's always rocking. It's such a great city, and it's leading the way not only on the minimum wage issue, of course, and on other issues that are so important to the country. And it's important that it starts in the Pacific Northwest, because it's one of the more progressive areas, if not the most progressive area of this country, and of the probably of North America, when you think of British Columbia is all about too. I want to talk to you a little bit about striking teachers. And, on our Free Speech TV show, we talked to Melissa Tomlinson, who's the assistant executive director of Badass Teachers, the best name in politics today, and definitely in progressive politics. And, they have increased their membership from about, I think, 17,000 people back around 2012-13 to now 65,000 people. And they were very instrumental in leading the strikes in places like Oklahoma and Texas and Red State, Utah, I believe, was another state. And now, of course, you have, more strikes in your state and coming up in California. So what are the issues locally? What is the momentum like? And I think it's wonderful that we're seeing labor, and particularly in the education field, strike back, because obviously the DeVos folks and the Trump administration and the charter school folks and others have really hit public education so hard. So what's the latest?
Well, of course, living in Seattle, where we're surrounded by what I call Godzillionaires, because there were some posters showing, Jeff Bezos stomping around Seattle like Godzilla stomping on buildings. But, with all these Godzillionaires around here, like the Bill Gateses and the Paul Allens and the Jeff Bezos and others, you would think that there would be enough money for public education in Washington State. But unfortunately, like much of the rest of the country, it just has not been a priority, even among some of the Democratic administrations who in this state were fighting, they had a small majority in the legislature, but it was really making it tough. A lot of the Republicans were blocking public education. We have a problem in Washington State, which we've talked about before, where we used to do the, Teachers Tuesday segments. And by the way, the head of the American Federation of Teachers today was tweeting about the governor's race in Michigan. So, education is on the line during these elections too, folks. So don't kid yourself. It's all tied in. But in Washington State, we have a levy system, and that means that each school district has to vote. The people in that school district have to vote on whether to approve each levy. So anytime there's an increase in funding or a new budget, they have to put it before the voters. Because in districts where folks have very few children in public school, they tend not to be too favorable. And in poorer districts where people can't afford the property taxes as much, then you get a lower budget for your school. So the Washington State Supreme Court ruled that this system of funding education is completely illegal according to our own state constitution, which requires an adequate funding source for K through 12 education. So there was a major decision, a lawsuit that was brought before the state of Washington called the McCleary decision. And in that decision, the Washington State Supreme Court ruled that the Washington State Legislature had violated our state constitution by not adequately funding K through 12 education. So they started to slap a $100,000 per day sanction on the state legislature. And at one point, after, Governor Inslee still failed to call a special session and nobody seemed to be wanting to solve the problem, there were some people asking the state Supreme Court, observers, gee, do you think we're going to have to throw some state legislatures in jail for contempt of court in order to get them to listen? Because the Washington State Supreme Court said very clearly years ago that we have an inadequate source for funding education. Even the Democrats in the state legislature and in the governor's house haven't addressed it. Only recently, Jeff, in June of this year, did the Washington State Supreme Court finally end its $100,000 per day sanction. And what that means is they were fining the state legislature $100,000 a day, and then that money was ordered by the court to be slated for education, for funding education in the future. So it was basically being put in the bank by the state legislature saying, okay, sorry, we know we're in contempt, but we'll end up using this for education funding at some time in the future.
Now, just to be clear, Mark, if you can, for those people who are not familiar with Seattle and Seattle metropolitan area, the teachers that are on strike are in Tacoma. Seattle has just recently settled their strike. And the community of Tacoma is how far from Seattle proper?
Well, SeaTac Airport is basically the Seattle's major airport. So, not too far. It's, depending on traffic, but it's just south of Seattle. They're sort of sister cities in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. They're both on the Puget Sound and share a similar kind of environment. The Seattle teachers last week actually did vote to go on strike, but at the very last minute, they did come up with a tentative agreement. There's also at least a half dozen other school districts in Washington State that have also either already gone on strike or have authorized strikes. So the Vancouver School District in Southwest Washington was also involved with this. Seattle does not currently have a strike, although it's a tentative agreement, so we don't know, what the future holds for that. But in Tacoma, yes, for the second week, teachers have walked out. And it is an issue of funding for a lot of people. It's just the idea that, there was a gentleman in Seattle here, in West Seattle, a couple of years ago, who actually donated a bunch of his own money to a public school because he was so just incensed that, the kids didn't have, up-to-date textbooks and things like that. So that's how bad it got in a so-called, progressive state. But in Tacoma, the teachers are out right now. The kids are not going to school, and the community is kind of, like they do during teacher strikes, kind of taking up the slack. There's a lot of volunteer daycare going on, and the Y's and the Boys and Girls Clubs are staying open in the community centers to try to take care of the kids while some folks are at work, But in general, there are a lot of people in the Seattle area who support the teachers and these movements. So they've been actually, the teachers in Tacoma were joined by Mandy Manning, who was chosen this year as the best teacher in the United States or whatever. She actually went to the White House and got a got an award for being the year's best teacher, but she has joined the picket lines there in Tacoma as of, I believe, yesterday or the day before. So it's a big ongoing issue, and it's not solved yet. I mean, there's still, according to the latest reports, there's still not adequate plans on the part of the state legislature or the governor's office to adequately fund education in Washington state. It's an ongoing problem. I think we may get some momentum on that issue now that it looks like we will gain a few more Democrats in the state legislature. If the primaries are any indication, the Republicans are losing a few more seats in the state legislature, which should help the Democrats push forward on some education funding. But Washington state has no income tax, Jeff. So
right, I want to ask you about that, because that's the other piece of the puzzle, Mark. Because for a long time, your education have not been funded by income tax, or I don't even know how it is being funded. Is it property tax related, or how does education in Washington state get funded?
Largely through the levies, which are property taxes. And then there's also some money that was supposed to be set aside from the state lottery to fund education. But there's still a lot of complaints that by the teachers that their salaries are not keeping up to pace, their benefits are not, the schools are still inadequately funded as far as the teachers are concerned. And that's been a big issue. It looks like it's also going to be a big issue in Los Angeles, because according to what I've been reading lately, it looks like the teachers there are getting ready to go on strike too. So, and that is a huge school district. So
well, let me talk to you first of all, just to get the connection here. A lot of people believe that it was Seattle proper that actually get the $15 minimum wage, but we look back at that 4 years ago, whatever it was actually the greater Seattle area within that SeaTac area that was there. Explain to the audience, not only here in New Hampshire, which is dealing with, of course, the overflow of what's happened in Massachusetts, with now in their 12th week locked out steel workers against the public utility national grid. So here in the Northeast, we're having issues with labor and corporations, and in your case, it's obviously the schools. But here you have a private utility company which has given the middle finger to the working class folks of the United States steel workers. But for those who are not familiar, it was the sort of area around Seattle, not Seattle proper, that gave us the minimum wage, and then I think Seattle and others have gone in that direction. Is that correct?
Yes. By the way, the tech companies here, the Amazons and other companies that have their headquarters here have not had a lot of union organizing and representation amongst their employees. So that's another issue we're dealing with here. But yes, the $15 an hour minimum wage actually started in SeaTac, Washington, which is its own incorporated city. Actually, Jeff, it's right there where SeaTac International Airport is located, and so the city itself is called SeaTac. And they were the first city in the country to adopt a $15 an hour minimum wage. Now that did spread to Seattle, and then largely through the auspices of our Democratic Socialist City Council member Shama Sawant, that became a national campaign, which is now all over the country, and there's major cities like San Francisco and others that are adopting it. And a lot of times it's on these wages are incrementally increased, so it's an attempt not to wipe out small businesses or whatever. So it's not like $15 an hour went up overnight in Seattle. It's incremental for businesses that are smaller and don't make millions of dollars. They have 3 to 5 years to institute this. So there will need to be another increase soon in the future, I'm sure. But it goes back in my mind to the fact that Washington state has the most regressive tax system in the country, and it's ridiculous. And it's another thing that our state government really needs to solve, and they just never seem to get off their seats and do it. And I think part of it is that the Democrats have always been really loath to suggest introducing an income tax in this state, as well as the Republicans, of course. So in Seattle, we have a 10%. It's like 9.98% sales tax. So
Very
who gets
regressive.
the hardest? The working poor, right?
No, that's always the
can't
case.
afford it.
When you end up with sales taxes or high property taxes, it's very regressive, and it hits the people very hard. The income tax is the most fairest way to do it. And, of course, many states don't want to do it. We've had now a good 40 years of Republicans saying government sucks, always about taxes too high, and we don't pay anywhere near where Europeans pay. And, of course, they have better services. They have free health care. They have free education. They have a lot of things that, collectively are put into the bucket, a certain tax or to do it another way. And this is what has really been problematic for, I think, our culture over the last, 40 or 50 years or so. But you're so right. And I'm wondering, does the teacher, and of course, you have the teacher of the year, are they still held in a high regard in Washington State? I mean, is that, you want your kid to grow up to be, a teacher kind of thing? Or is it still this 1980s philosophy is that, you want to be as rich as you can, be a Wall Street guy or gal. And is that still, and of course you have the Amazon world and the high tech world that's also very prevalent and Microsoft and so forth, in that part of the country too. How is that changing, and how is it changing with, the influx of the progressive Bernie Sanders, the Miss Savant, the socialist city councilor too?
I think in the Seattle area, there is a pretty high regard for education and teachers. And some of our local representatives are former educators. I know Nikita Oliver, who was a big support, got a lot of support from the People's Party and other progressive groups when she was running for mayor. She's an educator. Shama Sawant, the city council member, has a PhD in economics, and she was on the faculty at Seattle Central College. So there is a pretty high regard. We have Jesse Hagopian, who's an amazing activist here in Seattle, and also a Seattle public school teacher. He infamously got pepper sprayed walking home from a Martin Luther King Jr. celebration here a few years ago. So he was basically just went in the national media and said, guess what? A Seattle teacher just got pepper sprayed for being black in Seattle, basically is the way he put it. But he's a really outspoken activist. He's a great guy. He would be a great guest, actually, for you. He's really out there on the front in the teachers union, and is always willing to speak out on issues like civil rights and education. So I think there's a pretty high regard in this area. There are parts of the state that we've talked about before, which are Republican, a majority. And in some of those areas, yeah, people are loath to pay property taxes or vote for levies because they personally just don't like public schools. So there you go. Other states in the union do not have a monopoly on communities who don't support public education much these days. And that's too bad, because I think just like with journalists, we really need to start propping up our teachers and being proud of them and paying them better. And, I was going to say, Jeff, you mentioned something about the pushback by Republicans on some of these issues. And it's funny how, a lot of conservatives or Republicans or even libertarians they don't want to pay property taxes. They don't want to pay taxes to help the schools or the community. But, man, they don't seem to have much problem giving money to candidates in think tanks and PACs that, spend billions on propaganda trying to support their interests. So it's kind of funny where, they don't want to pay their property taxes, but they're more than willing to spend a lot of money on propaganda machines and buying media that will tell, like how did somebody describe Fox one time, media by the upper class for the middle class to blame the poor, something like that, where the priorities seem to be wrong here. The money should really be going to help the community, not just always in the pocket of some Wall Street banker. And that's something that I think people in Seattle are a little suspicious of, sometimes with the Democrats, but especially with the Republicans. And so if there's some way that we can come up with, some very adequate and efficient ways of supporting our public schools and supporting the working class and giving people a wage that will allow them to survive in Seattle and actually live here, then I think we will live up to the promise of this progressive Northwest culture, but we still have some work to do.
Well, let me ask you, this is something that I've been thinking about lately as you see the upset of Mike Capuano here with Liz Presley and Joe Crowley. Again, these are House members. But we could see something in New York on Thursday that could be a massive upset if Andrew Cuomo was to lose. Although the poll numbers show that he's up significantly, but again, so wasn't Capuano. Is there any thought that, again, somebody like Patty Murray, who came in as, of course, the woman in sneakers as a progressive and so forth, and Canfield, and the other senator. And I'm just wondering if people have said, all right, 20 years is enough. It's time for new blood to be your senator. Is there any thought about that at all? Because those two kind of stick out, as progressives that have been there for quite a while.
Yes, there's been talk about that ever since the Bernie-crat revolution in the state. But at the same time, they're facing the same thing that all these other candidates, like Carrie Harris was facing, where she was able to spend $100,000. Meanwhile, her opponent, the incumbent there in Delaware, spent $3 million. Mm-hmm. So that's what you're up against. The same thing is happening here with Sarah Smith. She's running against Adam Smith, a 21-year incumbent in the Democratic Party. And she's already outspent her by, hundreds of percent, so it's really difficult when you're starting that way. And then there's some limitations too that are placed on you as an insurgent candidate in getting access to information about voters and things like that. So it's an uphill battle for some of these people, but I think people here have been thinking about this for a long time. And Maria Cantwell is the woman you're talking about.
Yes.
No, she's no relation, but we've seen what happened with Ocasio-Cortez. We saw what happened with Presley, right? And now we're watching, Michigan, and it's happening all over the country where some writers, a particular writer that we were talking about at Democracy Watch News, he works at CNN, or he doesn't want to use the word progressive. So all these candidates to this one particular writer, Chris, you know who you are now, are liberals. But in reality, a lot of this has to do with the progressive
between movement. A liberal and a progressive, or even more so, a populist progressive, which brings in the whole economic factor. I think I know I had him on my show only once. He didn't last very long.
Well, it is a progressive movement, and there's some people even in the establishment news media, I think, who consider themselves neoliberals, and so are a little bit hesitant to support some of these new insurgent candidates. But ever since Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, it's now popular to be an insurgent candidate, and that did help Carrie Harris. And that, even though she didn't win, she's going to be back. And a lot of these candidates are just cutting their teeth now. This is the first time they've run for office. Sarah, they're in their, early 30s. Sarah Smith here has never run for office before. So they're learning the ropes right now as we speak, just like a lot of the Bernie-crats had to. And, once they get, a few races under their belt, watch out, you might have an insurgent governor in some of these states. And Scott Walker, you better watch out. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, well, we talked to Robert Craig about this earlier, and I think it's going to be the congressional races. I think you can, on a narrow level, you can go ahead and do that. On the national, on the statewide, it's much harder because, again, candidates like Carper can raise all this money. But hey, keep on fighting out there in Seattle, my friend. We got to run here, but we'll talk to you next Tuesday. And, we'll find out whether anything happens tonight in New Hampshire, tomorrow in Rhode Island, and Thursday in New York, and on our way to November. So we'll talk then, Mark. All the best. Check out his website and check out the great rock band, too.
Yes, and thanks for Robert Craig for being on again. And you, ladies and gentlemen, are listening to America's #1 best progressive talk show. So there you go. You're in the right place. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Mark. I didn't tell you to say that either. All the best.
Nope.
All right, folks. We'll talk to you next week, Mark. I want to thank our great producer, Jason, for doing the yeoman's work tonight and every night. And thank you for listening. Tomorrow we'll be back. We'll give you some results of what happened in New Hampshire tonight. But I ask you to keep on fighting and voting. My name is Jeff Santos, and right now, it's my time to say I gotta go.
You're listening to 1590 WSMN Nashua.
USA Radio News.
With mandatory evacuations already issued for parts of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, millions of Americans are preparing for what could become one of the most catastrophic hurricanes to hit the eastern seaboard in decades. Hurricane Florence is currently a Category 4 hurricane and about 350 miles south-southwest of Bermuda. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster says the time to evacuate is now.
We have 4 big highways leading from the coast. They will all be going, all lanes will be open only in one direction, that is away from the coast. We don't want to gamble with a single South Carolina life. We want to be sure everybody's safe. This might be inconvenient for some people, but we can worry about the inconvenience later.
The Irish government announced Tuesday that the planned trip by President Trump to Ireland has been postponed due to a scheduling problem. You're listening to USA Radio News.
Do you want a more honest media? Hello, my name is Robert Farrow, and I've grown tired of shadow banning, censorship, and one-sided reporting from today's news and social media companies. That's why my team created RightToVoice.com. We don't push aside. That's right, the number 2, and voice. We don't push aside. We include all the sides so you can make a choice in what you read and say and what appears on your wall. And we respect your privacy and don't sell your data. RightToVoice.com. It's the only place where you'll get all the news. It's usually one click to join, so check us out today. RightToVoice.com. We don't push aside. That's right, the number 2, and voice. We don't push aside. We include all the sides so you can make a choice in what you read and say and what appears on your wall. And we respect your privacy and don't sell your data. RightToVoice.com.
The White House reports the American economy is humming along with strong job creation, increased wages, rapid business growth, and soaring consumer confidence. USA Radio Network's John Clemens has more.
That was the assessment from Kevin Hassett, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, who says the increases in wages will outpace the inflation rate that is now right under 3%.
The best defense against increase in inflation is an increase in wages. And the CEA put out a report this week that documented that correctly measured real after-tax wages are growing about 1.4% this year. So that means that the wage growth that President Trump has helped create with his policies is overpowering the inflation numbers right now.
I'm John Clemens.
According to Bob Woodward's book Fear, then CIA Director John Brennan endorsed the Christopher Steele dossier when he first acquired a copy in December 2016, saying it matched the Russia collusion charges from his sources. A spokesman for Brennan has denied he ever approved the dossier. This is USA Radio News. For those who witnessed the horror of 9/11 close up, certain sounds and images are still embedded in their memory. Reporter recollections from USA Radio Network's Robin Walensky, who was at the World Trade Center reporting 17 years ago today.
There are triggers. 17 years later, when I hear the sound of an ambulance, it takes me right back to the streets in New York City, where I stood with other stunned people watching both towers on fire, then the South Tower collapsing in slow motion, and the North Tower following in the path of its twin. I remember looking up and thinking furniture was going out the window. The building's 110 stories tall, 1,000 feet in the air. The human eye can only see so far. But in reality, it was people, not furniture, going out the windows to escape the roaring fire. That was their best option. This is the image I believe top terrorist Osama bin Laden wanted Americans and the world to see.
House Republicans have introduced legislation to lock in cuts to individual tax rates beyond 2025. And speaking of those midterm elections, Maddie Duppler is a senior fellow at the National Taxpayers Union. She reminds us how most people vote.
I always say people don't vote with their checkbooks. They vote how they feel about their checkbooks. So with this good economic data, you're right. You can kind of go put your green eye shades on and you can see a lot of different numbers in front of you and ask what it means. But Americans right now feel more confident in their own economic circumstances.
That audio courtesy of Fox News. And remember, you can check us out online at usaradio.com. For USA Radio News, I'm Tim Berg.
It's 8:05. It's 74 degrees.